I'm telling you nothing but the truth. So I was making some saff one time, and I had a whole bunch of beef taller and mutton taller and English rosin and Bamagilliums. You know what a Bamagillium is? And I had it out there stirring it with a thing kind of like a boat oar and making this like this. And it was an old dog that got loose back up on the mountain belonged to Willie Farley. And he come down by there, and it was irritating me. And I reached over and smacked him on the hind end with that paddle. And he heeled over before he could lick it off. Now you talk about some good medicine, that was good. That was the healingest medicine I ever made. I'm like George Washington. George couldn't lie, I could, but I wouldn't want to. Doodlebug, come out of your house is on fire, your children burn up. Doodlebug. They came to the door and knocked. See, Roger said, "Don't guess you know me, my name's Roger." Said, "Yeah, I know you." Said, "I'd know you were hiding a tanning vat. But give me $1, $2, $3, $5. That rich black dirt would get down into the pores of their skin. I said, "Crumpecker hell." I know about Snakebite John. He was another one of the Lillys, including Red-Faced Joe and Crippled Joe, Giggly Bob,
Joe Dickey, Lilly,
Miller Bob, Barwaller Bob. They called him Quack. Half Bushel John, Blind Alfred Reed,
Fiddlin' John.
You ever know Big Earl? One-Legged Joe and
Scrappin' Dave,
Long-Legged Earl. Shooting Bob was his name. They called him Tommy Tight. Black Lewis.
His name was Wick Lilly.
Kenny Clyde, that was my uncle.
Called him Long
It
Clyde.
was Fussy Creek. Booge Harmon.
His Redhead Clyde. It's a groundhog's bunch of village.
Buckwheat Jim was one of them.
Grinning Jim.
Grinning Jim, right. Dabble Sam had a grist mill. Copperhead Dave Foley, One-Arm Bill. His wife had pretty ear bob. You remember Stinking Jim, don't you? It was a red-headed Clyde. Everybody just calls me Kent. I'm telling you nothing but the truth. Camp Creek got its name. The old timers would be walking, going from place to place, or driving horses or whatever, and they'd stop at Camp Creek. The water was so wonderful and clean, and they'd camp out all night there and let their horses fill up on that good water. And the Indians had a trail through here that went plumb on into Kentucky. You can find plenty of artifacts along these trails if you watch for them. And my wife's daddy, granddaddy, was coming up here from North Carolina. They stopped to water his horse and was attacked by some rogues, and they took his money, and he fell off with the horse, or was throwed off or something, drowned in Bluestone River. And I wasn't raised here, my wife was. I didn't pay any attention to her, went to class with her. She paid no attention to me. But anyhow, I went to the Army, and one day I came back and they said, I saw her down at the post office. I said, "Do you want to go chinky pin hunting tomorrow, Pauline?" She said, "Yeah." It would have been Sunday. So we went chinky pin hunting, and yeah, started romancing after so many years and so on. We got married, and we've been married 59 years. And I believe if I was to marry again, I'd find me another Meadows. She is a Meadows. I am a Lilly, Kent Lilly. A lot of people just want to call me Joe, but don't like that because there are too many Joes in this country, and it'd take me a while to tell you how many Joes there are without you want me to tell you, and including Red-Faced Joe and Crippled Joe and One-Legged Joe. Most everybody just calls me Kent. This is my friend, Brother Euless Lilly, the best tenor singer these parts has ever produced, and we've had some good ones. I'd give you a little pitch right here if you'd give us a little tenor.
Well, can't,
Do-me-do-so-do.
can't sing now. I got bronchitis. I always use a pitch pipe, for I think 98% of my singing was without music. In the primitive Baptist style.
Yeah.
I love that.
You have a hymnal in your pocket there, right?
No,
Don't have one.
but I like that kind of singing that without music. And I like that doctrine when I was a little boy. And then I got to be a big boy, and I still like it.
Yeah.
It kind of a part of me.
You remember Stinking Jim, don't you? He had a little bit of odor to him, but the only thing he had to take it off was homemade soap, and it kind of itched the skin. So he didn't use much of it. Stinking Jim, they called him.
Yes, his name was Lilly. He was born June 11, 1895. And he died June 11, 1995. He lived 100 years and died on his birthday. Hearst didn't bring him up here, they brought him on the back of a truck.
Kenny Clyde, that was my uncle. He was born in 1889, and he was supposed to die right away. He just couldn't hold his food down or anything, had dyspepsy. Now, dyspepsy is a stomach disorder. And so they picked out a place to bury him and made a cemetery there. And he went ahead, since he was such a small child, he didn't know that there's anything wrong with him, and he just went ahead and lived. If he'd have been a big person, he'd have knew that he was sick, and he'd have worried himself to death, see. And so since he went ahead and lived like that, eventually his mother died, and they put her in there. And eventually his daddy died, and they put him there beside his mother. And then one of his brothers and his wife died, and they put him in there. Another one of his brothers died, and they put him in there. This is 1934 that they buried him. Then after a while, my daddy died, and they put him in there. And my mama put her in there. And last of all, Skinny Clyde died. And instead of being skinny, they called him Pusley-Gutted Clyde. And he weighed 240 pounds, about as big as I am, I guess. But they used to be Skinny Clyde, that's what they called him. And he told me that he used to work in Beckley, and it's 26 miles from Beckley to here. And he'd work at 5 o'clock in Beckley on Saturday evening, walk home to Camp Creek at night, and tend a little dance and dance some for him. He was so skinny, he was a regular contortionist, and he could do every kind of a step in the world. And he would dance for him till way up towards the morning hours, and then go home and spend the night and walk back to Beckley on Sunday evening. And he was the one that sailed the ship over here and run up the James River as far as he could run it, and jumped out and joined the Patriots' cause. When they get their name, they were French people, and they sold things. If you had something to sell to somebody, you said, let's get a barker. Instead of an auctioneer or something, let's get a barker. Hey, how much am I over for this here? Somebody give me $1, $2, $3, $5. Mash fork. It really shouldn't be mash. It was M-A-R-S-H, Marsh Fork. And you go up Marsh Fork, and there was a man named Wiley Sneed that lived up there. He was a moonshiner, supposed to be the best that there was in the country. Made the best kind of booze. And one time my father and Bill Rumberg were coming in home, and in those days you used paths, you didn't use roads. And they looked down upon a house down there, and there was a man hanging from a peach tree with a cord around his neck. And the old lady had got mad at her husband, who made this wonderful booze, but he had drunk some of it. He liked it too. And she and her boy hung him to break him of that habit. She was into it for the profit, and he liked to have a little fun out of it. So they cut him down. And Dad said that the old man liked to never quit thanking him for their service to him by cutting that peach tree down and getting him out of that rope. There was an Englishman bought a place up here, and some of them killed him because his wife had pretty earbobs, earrings, and they called them earbobs. And so they found her finally a few years back. Some of them was cutting timber back in there and found a man and a woman in a big holler tree. Somebody had stuffed her bones back in there. People nowadays don't have boils like they used to. When I was a kid, it was nothing uncommon to see a person with boils all over him. Even old righteous Job in the Bible, he had his share of the boils, you know. And they would peel that hard shell off of the egg and dump the contents out, and that'd leave you a little thin membrane on there. And you put it on top of the boil, and it would draw up when it dried and draw that core out of there and cause it to burst itself. And then that was one way of getting rid of it. Another one was oatmeal, just plain old oatmeal that you eat. Just pour water on it and mix a kind of a paste out of it and put it on there, and it would do the same thing. It would dry up and draw it out. And then there was another remedy. You could take white plantain. White plantain, it grows in very poor ground, and you bruise it. Just put it in your hand or something and strike a stick or a rock, and it would secrete a juice, kind of like plasma or something like that. And you put that on there, and it was good for a boil. It was also good for a sore. If you had fall sores on you or something like that, or if you had diarrhea, you could take that white plantain and bruise it and put it down in some hot water and get a tea out of it and drink it, and it would draw your stomach up and cut those glands out from secreting all that stuff. It made your bowels want to run off, and it would actually help you. Blackberries. I hated blackberries with a passion because the cows would go through there and scratch their udder, and then when you go to milk them, there was a big sore, and when you squeezed that, they'd kick a milk bucket out of your hand, you know, and set off a chain reaction. But a man told me to get some of that and give to her, and I did. And it was in the winter time, and I couldn't find any good blackberries, so I went to this old man's house that had carried that coal all that distance, and he had some blackberries that was 18 years old. And they told me how old he was, and the reason they knew how old he were because they canned him the year he went to the pen, and they opened them when he came back and gave me some of them, so they knew the age of them right away. And but that fixed the diarrhea up on her. Now, there is another good remedy that's growing out there, and a lot of people call it jewel weed. If you would buy it, you probably got some of these flowers. Impatiens, that's another blowed up name for it, but you get the wild ones out here in the wild, and they always grow in a rich, succulent soil. And you just give them a squeeze and the water will run out of them, and they're good for just about anything that ails you. If you got gnats are biting you, eating you up, or if you got abrasions on you, get you some of that juice out of those and put on you. and I just about guarantee it to fix you right up. It was an old man lived down the road down there below me. He had some cows that got sick one time and couldn't find out what was wrong with them, and he called my grandpa, and he went down there and he told him that he had holler horn. Well, every cow's horn is hollow to some extent, but anyhow, he said, "What'd you do for that?" And he told him what to do. Put some rowel root on it. Hellboro was the name of it, but the old timers called it rowel root. And Grandpa told him to put that rowel root in her, and they could split their brisket. That's a dewlap on a cow. If you eat corned beef, you use a cut of that right there, and makes you a mighty fine mess of stuff. And you cut a hole, pull it down and cut a hole through there like that, and stick a bunch of that rowel root in there, and when it dries up and falls out, your cow ought to be well if she's still around. You ever in a haunted house? Did you ever see blood where somebody been murdered on a board? You can't scrub it off or anything. You can use a sand rock and can't even get it off of it. And this old man had got killed down there, and they couldn't never figure out what was wrong with him. And this old man lived upstairs in that house. He had killed him, and when he went to bed, then his blood was on his feet, and he carried it up there. And they'd lay in bed of a night, and they'd hear all this screaming and carrying on, and they found out by that he was the one, the perpetrator of the crime. And so they got him, and they sentenced him. They took him before Judge Moy and tried him, and Judd found him guilty and fined him $3 and a poke of tobacco. He was out of tobacco, and he figured that he'd get him enough that way to go on, and so that way they stopped that murder in here, they sure, because they got the one that did it there, and put such a heavy fine on him. Nobody else ever wanted to murder anything. Now, Camp Creek was a clean community when I lived there. They wasn't outside of that murder. There wasn't no crime that ever happened there. There wasn't even a divorce in all Camp Creek. Well, there was one family that parted, but they didn't divorce. You know, that was a dirty word, until they built the turnpike through. Route 77 it is today. And before that time, you could go to bed of a night and not lock your door, not cock your shotgun or set an axe out there beside the bed or anything like that, and the next morning you'd be there. But after that went through, I counted 11 cases of it right there in Camp Creek, where somebody had left a wife up in Michigan or something and moved down here and took off one down here, and they'd sprung over just a leapfrog thing, and I never seen the beat in all my life. That's happened to Camp Creek. And in those days, people knew everybody as their neighbor, knew where they lived, what they'd be doing. But now then, if you'd ask me now who lives in such and such a place, I couldn't tell you, because Confederate soldiers and Yankee soldiers that met up here on top of this hill, and they just pulled their guns and shot it out. And one of the bullets went through a Yankee soldier's testicle, and went on over and hit a little old farm girl over there that was going out to spring to get a bucket of water, and carried it on over there and hit her and impregnated her, and she bore a child, and they named him Booge Harmon. Grandpa raised homemade tobacco and twisted it in twists, bite a chunk of it off or crumble it up and smoke it in a pipe. He'd see Grandpa coming, he'd say, "Hello, Uncle Dade, if you dot any butter, if you ain't dot homemade, don't me mind if I chur." Dad used to teach school back up in there in one of them at Bear Creek School, and he'd take his shotgun with him when he was going to school. And if it was a good evening coming back in, he'd get him a mess of squirrels, and Mom would cook them and make squirrel gravy and dumplings out of them. Next morning we'd have a glorious breakfast. Other than that, it was just gravy and biscuits. That was a standby. Dad used to sell turkeys. In those days, they called it drawing a turkey. You tied their legs together and hung them up on a pole, and you took a sharp knife and split them here in the throat. Well, by the mouth being shut, it didn't leave room for any disease germs to go in there and pollute that bird. And so we said the best market we could find was St. Louis, Missouri. And we'd pack them in a barrel of ice at the railroad station and ship them down there. So far down the road, the railroad company would re-ice those turkeys. And then when they got to St. Louis, they'd have farm fresh turkeys. And the way that we would dress them, after they had properly bled and give up the ghost, we would pluck the feathers off of them dry. And that way the skin didn't break. And that farther kept the diseases and vermin and botulism and all that poison that's killing people today. It just wasn't around then because we so clean it didn't get a chance to get in the meat. And that's for the days of government inspectors. I think these government inspectors is what's brought all this disease germs and so on in, so many of them. And they wash their hands and throw their water out, and it's bound to pollute some creek and get down to Charleston, and get into some of those offices down there. But anyhow, we never had a person to die from poisoned turkey. Dad was a considerate person, so he gave this little boy a turkey, baby turkey. And we raised our turkeys on cornbread and buttermilk and table scraps and grasshoppers and chinky pins and stuff like that. But them, they had maybe not quite as much as we did, and so they fed theirs house flies. And when this turkey'd come through the house, beep, 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 they knew that it was wanting something to eat, and they'd grab the fly swatter, and they'd see a big fly out there, and they'd smack that thing, and at least numb that fly or stupidify it, and that old turkey'd come flying right over to it and grab that fly out of your hand, and he'd eat it, and then we'd kill another, and we'd just take it through the house. And that was the reason we didn't have any flies in those days. The turkey ate them all up. Well, there was an old man named Joseph Peters. He owned all the land around Camp Creek, and then finally, after he got old, his boys were doctors, and they'd moved into Princeton, the city of Princeton, so he kind of tailed them up there. And Dad had heard about him, but he'd never seen any of them. Some of them asked him if he'd like to have a banana. He said no, that he never had ate any of them. And Uncle Joe says, here, take one and try it. He did eat it and get out around behind the store and kind of hide like that so nobody wouldn't know what he's doing and eating. And he asked him how he liked it, and he said he liked it all right, but it had an awful big cob in it. There's a woman lived right on up the road up here. Us kids would go by, and she couldn't tell time. And we'd say, "Hey, Dory!" She'd come and open the window and look down the railroad at us, and we'd say, "What time is it?" And she'd say, "One hand's toward the chicken house and the other's toward the creek." She had a baby one time and it got sick, and she left it with Miss Russell, who lived right over there where that syringo bush is. That's a mock orange in today's society. And she looked at that thing and It was sick and not behaving well, and so she put it off there with Miss Russell. And Miss Russell, she give that thing everything she could give it. She'd give it sugar tits and all this stuff. Did you ever see a sugar tit? Why, you take a piece of sackcloth that sugar used to come in and put about a teaspoonful of sugar in there and tie a string around it real tight, and it'll look like an acorn. And a baby will suck it until he's sucked all that. Oftentimes he quits crying and goes to sleep before he gets done sucking, but evidently this one must have had a tough suck button to suck. And so this old Miss Russell told that woman, Dory, said, that kid of yours said you took so long to go down there. Well, it's 2.5 miles from here to Camp Creek and 2.5 back. And you walk all that, you walked a pretty good distance. And she said that she got that baby up, said, well, the thing to do is to grind the onion up and then mash it and get the juice out of it and put some sugar in it, and said it'll stop any baby from crying. And so after that happened, Miss Russell always squeezed some onion juice out. Old Buttercup. Dad bought that and gave it to Ma for a birthday present one time, his little old yellow Guernsey. And she was an orphan calf and just a day or two old, and that's back during the days when you didn't have nipples for everything. So she put milk in a wash pan and stuck her finger up through the milk, and the calf would get a hold of her finger, and she'd dip it in the milk and stick it up there, and the calf would learn to suck her finger, and she'd gradually lower it down in the pan so it just would suck the pan dry. And eventually she deprogrammed the calf and got it so it would just drink milk out of the pan. And this cow grew up to be a very efficient cow. And I calculated one time how many gallons of gravy that she had manufactured. And that was back during the Depression day, and if you had gravy to eat, you had something to eat. And we grew our own wheat and our own corn, and we'd brown a little bit of it in a skillet. And then we would dump some of her milk in on it and give it a quick stir or two and have gravy for breakfast and have biscuits to go with it made naturally from home ground flour. And I did a little calculation one time on her, and she made over a railroad car full of gravy during her life, in addition to the milk we give to other people that didn't have any milk. It's amazing how much that one cow can give like that. And I would go to hunt this cow, and the creek be up high, and I'd get on her back and ride her across the creek, and the other cows naturally would go, but she was pet thing, but being raised by hand like that. As soon as I get on the other side of the creek, I'd jump off of her and let her go on till we got to the next creek crossing. And one day I decided I'd really give her a good shakedown and take a good ride, and I got a horse's bridle and put it on her. She'd never had a bridle on her before, didn't like it very well. I didn't adjust the head stalls on it, so the bridle was really too long for her head. And I jumped on her back and I gave her a kick in the rib, thought we'd take off and have a real ride, and she just shook her skin like a cow would shake a fly off or something. And she shook me off of there, and right through the air I went and into a laurel bush and a rock pile. And it hurt me terrible. And I came out of there and I looked up the road and down the road both to see if there's anything coming that'd be laughing at me, and it wasn't. And I decided the coast was clear, and I crawled out. Needless to say, I never did try a cow ride anymore after that. Crumpecker was a sheriff here. Isn't that an odd name? There's a hill over here, Crumpecker Hill. 4-lane hard road there now. Used to be just a little wiggly lane across that. And so I was supposed to go over to Bluefield, and the conservation officer was going to work with me. I had a flat tire, and I couldn't get no farther to save my neck. And this conservation officer called and wanted to know where I was. And I told him I was on Crumbpecker Hill. We had lady radio operators then. They didn't know nothing about these names up here. Like one of them over was Fussy Creek. Now, wasn't that a name? And the boss would call me every time say, there ain't no such place as Fussy Creek. I said, well, yeah, it's on the map. All you got to do is look it up. And but anyhow, it flabbergasted her when I said Crumbpecker Hill. And she come back again and said, would you repeat that? I said Crumbpecker Hill. So then it was time for her to hand that message over. That conservation officer was standing by in Bluefield. And she said, 434, he's on his way to Bluefield. But they were just petite little girls, and they blushed more than they do now. The Bible, there's scripture in the Bible, I can't think of it right offhand, but it says that people have lost their blush, and they have. Oh, I hear people on radio and television now talking and using what I call a real filthy language. And back when I was a kid, nobody talked that way. I didn't talk to my mommy about anything. For instance, somebody might have a gas problem or something like that, and I wouldn't tell Ma or talk to Ma about it or anything. We had her blush. We just didn't talk filthy like that. We had a cow one time. It was really an efficient cow. Old Buttercup, she was good for butter, and I guess she probably saved a many person's life during that depression, to keep them from starving to death. But this one here was a money-making cow. The next one we got, she was a black cow. Never did like black cows, don't know why. You feed a black cow green grass, she gives white milk and white butter. You give a yellow cow green grass, she gives white milk and yellow butter. Just never did know that. We didn't like her butter, it was too pale. But anyhow, it had the same fat content to it that the other did. And so we were, Dad was one day calculating how valuable that cow was. She'd have a calf every year, and we'd grow the calf up, and the calf would bring about $25, which was a big chunk of money for those days. And we didn't have to feed her any, so we didn't have to discount that. You see, she sucked herself, and she'd eat this grass, and her body would convert it into milk, and then she would just suck the milk, and it would convert it back. And so it's this perpetual motion. We just never did have to spend anything on her. Everything was profit. Never had such a cow set in life. And Dad had a collar made for her to go around her to keep her from eating too much. He's afraid she might die from overeating. What's they call that, bulimia now or something like that? One time my daddy, he was a very knowledgeable person. I never run into any kind of a problem that he couldn't solve. I'm not bragging, I'm just telling the truth. And so he told us to never eat creasy greens without you cooked them. That you boiled them down and the water took some of the strength out of them, and so on and so on. So he was gone for some purpose. And we got out and picked us a mess of creasy greens. They're in a class with mustard and all that kind of stuff, but much better. And radishes, watercress. We'd heard people talk about eating them and just eating them raw. And Dad had told us not to do that. So he wasn't there. We had supper and we fixed us up a mess of them and cut them up and put meat, grease, and vinegar on them and ate them with a long-handled spoon and stuffed them down and got rid of them. And that night it hit us. Every one of us had to urinate. He told us that. And every one of us got set on fire. He had told us that. Said they'll burn you up. And every one of us in those days they had lard buckets or something like that you'd get lard in. And every one of us had a lard bucket sitting around where we could grab it right fast. And Barwaller Bob. Barwaller was one Bob, Lily. There were lots of Bobs. And right out from his house, he had a field there of buckwheat, and he couldn't grow anything in it, but that was the bears' natural wallering place. They'd come through there for centuries, and he never did get a crop of buckwheat out of it, because every time a buckwheat would get up big enough to start blooming, the bears would come in and waller it down, and then they'd have to wait until next year and sow him another crop. So that's a prominent place. If I had a map of Summers County, I could show you Barwaller Ridge. There's a Barwaller out on Route 99. The same thing happened with the bears there. They'd come up and waller to get the insects and vermin, and that rich black dirt would get down into the pores of their skin, and they didn't nothing dare touch them because it was just loaded with minerals and all these herbs and so on, and to straighten them right out. Used to be some McBrides lived way up here on out from a Willie Farley place. One of these McBrides was in a store over at Matoka. He said he just felt funny and felt like somebody needed something, and said he walked up to a preacher, Goodring, and preacher said that he was hard up and broke and didn't have no money to buy any grub for his family. And he said, I just handed him a $10 bill. That's when a $10 bill was as big as a battleship. And he bought enough grub to tide his children over for a week or so. Since we're going to Princeton today, we'll stop and see Willard McBride, one of those. But Willard knows he's related to these McBrides up here, but he can't tell you how close he is.
Yeah, I started whittling when I was young, and I've been doing it ever since. So how many pieces? It'd probably fill this whole house. I get these crazy ideas. What if I did this, and what if I done that, and then there it is.
Kitty cat over here.
No, it's a dog.
Dog. Okay.
The kids had guns to play with. I didn't have any. So I took a saw and drove the gun out on a board and sawed it out. But then I learned if we got a knife, and I started rounding off the barrels and the handles, and the first thing you know, I can make a gun as good as they had. And that's what started me whipping. This is a double quarter pounder. This is just one of my crazy ideas. People's always saying, how do you make that little stuff? Well, when you make it, it's on a big stick. When you finish it, you cut it loose. That's how you make that little stuff. They bring it out for parades. They keep it down there in the armory. And I went down there and took some pictures and come home and built me one. Upside the head.
Right. Well, on this side over here was the set we come from, and you get over there, and it was the groundhog lilies. You know any groundhog lilies?
This one that I was telling you about lived 100 years old, died on his birthday. That's a groundhog's bunch of lilies.
Yeah. Well, anyhow, for some reason or other, they didn't want to be called groundhog. It was below their dignity and so on, and I knew a Tom Lilly who lived at Pipestem. Gravelly Point's where he lived on. That's the road that goes down to Bull Falls from Pipestem. And he had a boy that got a job and was working with me. And one day he said, "What set of lilies are you out of?" And I really didn't know, but I just made a rough guess and said, I'm out of the groundhog lilies. He said, that's what I'm out of, and he grinned great big. But they didn't like for you to call him a groundhog. One of them killed a fellow because he called him a groundhog. I don't know a whole lot to tell you about the buckwheat lilies.
One was named Grinning Jim.
Grinning Jim, right. Grinning Jim had a boy that lived at Flat Top, and he always was grinning. And one of them went possum hunting one time, and the dog treed a possum, and he couldn't get it to come down, and it had no limbs on it so he could hold to and get up there to it. And so they named him Grinning Jim. And the reason for the Grinning Jim was that he just sat there and grinned at that possum until the possum got tired of it and come down out of there. So that's where the possum gets his grin, off of Grinning Jim. This old fellow was working up here for a Dalton, and he didn't have any palate in the roof of his mouth, and therefore he was tongue-tied just a little bit or something wrong. They asked him what he was doing. He said he'd been poling hogs for Bob Stovall, and they wanted to know how you poled hogs, and said stick a pole up the rear and hold them up and let them eat acorns. These old timers had a terrible time with witches. I can remember old man George Madders had a cow down there that got sick, and they split her tail and put salt and pepper in it, and that didn't pepper out. They called it the holler tail that they had. Their tail would just hang limp like hanging a mop across the clothesline, and the only time it'd be any movement there's when the wind would blow it along or something like that. And so he got out his almanac and got to reading, and called Dr. Pettigoat, lived over here next to Athens. He was a moon doctor, and talked to him about it, and he told him what to do for the cow. And so they bored a hole in a log in the barn and filled it full of sulfur, and then they drove a white hickory peg in there. Now, and when that peg rotted off and spilt that sulfur out there, it would cause this curse to die and go away. Well, the reason why I used white hickory, because white hickory rots about quicker than anything else, and the moisture in those valleys down there was high, and I guess you'd call it humidity today, and so it rotted this peg out and spilt that stuff down there, but it still didn't cure the cow. She got better, but it didn't cure it. And old man George got up there and got to looking around one day, working, and decided he wanted to drink, and went over to the spring, and the spring had been dry for quite a while and didn't have any water in it. So they determined that maybe the cow wasn't getting the proper amount of water to make her do that. And so they cut off one horn and caught it full of water and went down there and give her a drink out of another spring. And you couldn't overfeed him like that, because if you did, it would give them a holler foot, and it would cause their feet to come off, the shell, toenails. So tied her in a swamp. Didn't let her get her neck down to the water so she could drink, drove a stop up in there so her head would have to be high. And they just give her one of her horns full of water until they got her broke into it, and then they turned her loose, and she lived and went ahead, and her toes never came off. Other than that, I guess the witches would have took care of her if they hadn't used some shrewd thinking and done all that kind of work to drive the witches away. There was one down here, buried down here at Jumping Branch, called One Arm Bill.
I know where that's at.
Yeah.
That cemetery.
Well, you know anything on him, why he went to Indiana?
No, I don't.
he got captured by the Yankees and carried to
I
Indiana.
believe I remember.
And then they put him in prison up there, and he escaped from them and got an arm shot off. So they call it one-arm Bill. There used to be a Murphy store in Princeton, and I think every other little town had one of them. The most wonderful store that's ever been. You could get anything that you wanted in there. If you had a dime, if you didn't, some of them would buy it for you. And there was an old man named Blind Alfred Reed that would sit outside the door, and he had a guitar. Probably got it from selling seeds. And on this guitar was mounted a can that would be about like one that you'd get tuna in or something. And he'd play a tune, and somebody that had a soft spot in their heart would come up and drop a nickel or a quarter one in that. And the first thing you know, he'd have a cup full of coins, and he'd go somewhere and empty them down his boot top or somewhere, I guess. And people would pitch in and contribute to the cause, and he'd grin about it and come back next week, and he'd teach you how to play music, pretty good at it. He played the fiddle too. He was a good boy. He'd saw that thing. He wasn't a moneyed man. God bless his soul. But I do believe that he was a soul winner. Did you ever eat a grasshopper at the Locust? Well, I tried some one time. Acme had a store here in Princeton, Bluefield, and spread out pretty big. And one of the stores had some canned grasshoppers in it. And I looked them over, and I thought they must be all right, or Acme wouldn't have them. They was passed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I dwelt on that a while back, and so I got one of them boxes and took them home and asked the wife and kids if they wanted some, and I don't know, they didn't eat many, if any. And one of my old school teachers asked me if I ate any of them. I said, yeah, I ate the tympanium off of one of them. If you're a biologist, you'll know what that is. If it's not, it's a hind leg. Well, they just got too bad. And I did. I've eaten better things, but they eat them in the Philippine Islands over there. Good. Boy, they just eat them like I ate popcorn. My boy killed a rattlesnake, and he was nice and clean about it and brought it home. And I did skin it by myself, so I know that it was skinned well. Wanted to get the hide to make a belt out of. They make a good belt, and they make a good hat band too. And you put the rattlers down in your fiddle, and it makes it fiddle a little bit better. You being a fiddler, do you have any rattlesnakes in yours? Well, good. It'll play better now. And so anyhow, we did take that home, and Pauline's one of the best cooks. You could take a dish rag to her, and she could cook you a meal out of it, and it would be good. And anyhow, we got this rattlesnake off. She got this rattlesnake all cooked up. First chew was pretty good. And then after that first chew, it began to getting tougher, and the more I chewed it, the tougher it got. And so we have never, ever cooked any more rattlesnake at home. This story's supposed to be true, but there might be parts of it that's not. I got a big mud turtle and took it home, and about that time we got our refrigerator. And by the way, we've still got it. And I got it in 1950. I killed that mud turtle, and we kept several cows and put her milk in crocks, 2-gallon crocks, and a gallon crock, and butter in another crock, and sweet milk in a jug to drink, and shake it up and shake the cream through it. And so I got that mud turtle all dressed up, and Pauline cooked it. Now, when you cook a mud turtle, if you let them get cold, they'll get tough and come back to life, you know. And I never did believe that. And that night we was laying in bed, and I heard something crash bang inside the refrigerator. And I looked down there. I got up and ran in the kitchen, and there was that mud turtle laying out in the floor where it had kicked the door open. And so I hollered at Pauline and had her to come in there. And she said that she wasn't going to never cook any more of it anyhow. And we haven't eat any because I decided that if they's that tough and wanted to live that hard, that I wouldn't kill them. And do you like duck dumplings? I lived right down the creek here a mile in that White House. And people pull her take a team of horses and hook it to a sawmill boiler and pull into your place, and they'd cut you timber and stay there and board and pay you a little bit of money for boarding. And Ma would get about $1 a day out of boarding and feeding these wood hicks that stayed here. That's what they call themselves now, wood hicks. And so she sent me over there one time to get a duck, and she killed that duck and boiled it in a kettle and made dumplings with it. Well, after a while, there was one boarder there named Paul Boland from Hinton, West Virginia, and he said, "I believe I'll take a little bit of that duck up there." He looked in there and he said, "Oh boy, duck dumplings in there." I said, "I always did like duck dumplings." I had a sister that was probably 4 or 5 years old at that time, and she'd put her chewing gum under the plate to save it so it wouldn't fall off and get lost anywhere. And then when she passed it to get some grub herself, it fell off in his dumplings. And so he thought he got a duck gizzard. He said, "Oh boy, a duck gizzard." Said, "I never seen one that pink before." And he socked his fork down in that bowl of duck and drawed it out. He bit into it, and it stuck to his teeth, and boy, he had a time pulling them loose, but he enjoyed the meal and kept boarding there. They'd eat all the gizzard that you'd cook them. Of course, I like it too. Some people cuts it up and makes some kind of a pate or something like that with it, but we always just cut it up and put it in a biscuit and put some gravy on top of it and ate it, and that was the end of the day for us. This tree right here behind me is a black walnut, a Julius Niagara or something like that, on the order like that, and it's a mean tree. It don't like company, so it puts off poison. And many plants don't grow close to it. Some of the plants that will grow close to it are raspberry and ginseng. I do grow some beans under this and a few potatoes, but I'm not in a big mood to produce a lot of record-bearing fruits. I'm just interested in existing, and so I get along with the walnut tree, and I watch the squirrels come down and take them off and hide them. And so I went around my whirly wicker whacker. I met Bomb Backer, and I called Tom Tacker to get Bomb Backer out of my whirly wicky whacker. Did you know what I was talking about? That was a horse that got out, and my dog was Bomb Backer, and my whirly wicker whacker was the field of corn that I had him in there. Yeah, I know about snakebite John. He was another one of the Lillys. He's on that tribe there. He was Edmund's boy. And Edmund was the son of Robert Lilly that married to Fanny Moody. And they lived to be 110 years old and 114. respectively. Now, Edmund built a house for Alfred Beckley, who was the founder of Beckley, the city of Beckley, West Virginia. And Alfred has in his diary, "Ye old John Lilly built me a house." So that's this fella that I'm going to tell you about. Now, John Lilly had a boy named Lewis Lilly. And Lewis Lilly had a boy named Dayton Lilly. And Dayton had a boy named Earl. And Earl had a boy named Kent. And so this is old Kent talking to you now. And we Lillys have always respected snakes and killed every one that we could find. Never did go snake hunting, but if one's around, I try to get him out of the way. And Grandpap was building a fence down on what's now Bluestone Lake, and a copperhead bit him. So he tried to get home as quick as he could, which was a mistake. Caused his heart to start beating faster and pumped all that poison up there to his heart. And when he got home then, they dug a hole. The earth was nice and cool, and they dug a hole to put his leg down in that hole so it'd stay cool. And then they, on the cooling side, then they got some of the best liquor that they could find, which was plentiful, and fed him some of that, and he was dead in 3 hours. So goes the story of Snakebite John. I passed through there and found his tombstone, and it had written on there that some of them called him Wid before they named him that, and said, "Here lies the bones of Wid. The snake bite didn't kill him, but the cure did."